Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. We have three guests for you today. They are Michael Kofman, Robert Litwak, and Katarina Kertysova. Michael is a Wilson Global Fellow who serves as Director of the Russia Studies Program at CNA Corporation. Rob is the center's Senior Vice President and its Director of International Security Studies. And Katarina is a Public Policy Fellow with the European Leadership Network in London and also a Wilson Global Fellow. Great to see all of you. Thank you for joining us. So today we're going to be talking about the Open Skies Treaty and the withdrawal of the United States, the pending withdrawal of the United States, and what that might mean for the larger discussion of global arms control. So let's start informationally, Katarina, and if we can ask you to tell us what is the treaty, what is its significance?
So the Open Skies Treaty is in essence a monitoring agreement and a confidence building instrument that allows its 34 member states, those include Russia, Ukraine, United States and other European countries, to conduct joint unarmed observation flights over each other's territory to collect information on military forces and activities. And the treaty's unique feature is that during these overflights, representatives of both the observing state and the observed state can sit together in one aircraft. So as such, it's an instrument where officers from NATO and Russia, as well as other countries, can engage with each other on a regular basis, what increases mutual trust. And just to mention that since 2002, when the treaty entered into force, over 15,000 reconnaissance flights were carried out that helped increase military transparency and predictability in Europe in particular.
Thank you. Michael, when President Trump announced that the United States would leave the treaty, he essentially blamed Russia. Russia didn't adhere to the treaty, so until they adhere, we will pull out. That was his statement. Is it a fair criticism?
I mean, it's a fair criticism that Russia imposed unilateral restrictions on overflights in two cases, namely the overflight distance over Kaliningrad and the sort of unrecognized breakaway territories in Georgia, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia. But the United States imposed reciprocal restrictions on Russian overflights in the United States, for example, over Hawaii and military infrastructure in Hawaii. So it's true that Russia was in violation, but proportional and reciprocal restrictions were made on Russian overflights in response to that. In my view, there's just people in the administration that were looking for a good reason to get out of a treaty. The treaty is quite beneficial, not just to the United States, but to the other 33 participants in it, particularly European countries that don't have the same capabilities as the United States for geospatial observation and military infrastructure. So it now kind of puts into question and jeopardy whether or not Russia will ultimately stay in the treaty once the United States withdraw, assuming the United States makes good on that threat, and what that means for the other European countries.
Yeah, Rob, Michael just said if the United States follows through with its threat, that's been a way that this administration has done business. They've almost floated it out there that maybe we're going to do this, and sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Mike Pompeo said the U.S. would fully exit the treaty in 6 months, but he said, we may, however, reconsider our withdrawal should Russia return to full compliance with the treaty. What's happening?
Let me pull back the optic and look at the broader context of this debate, because it's an ongoing one in U.S. foreign policy over big issues. Since the end of the World War II, and especially since the end of the Cold War, the debate has been the extent to which American interests are served through the integration of the United States through institutions, following norms, the role of arms control flows from that, or not. John Eikenberry from Princeton wrote a very influential book at Wilson, where he argued that this has been America's winning strategy, that channeling American power through institutions has made it less threatening, more legitimate in the eyes of others, and has been an effective strategy. There is a contending view, though, that views these international institutions as encumbrance, that they constrain American action, and that in the current era, where the pendulum under the Trump administration has shifted toward what some have called isolationism, probably doesn't capture the whole dynamic, but their own kind of rubric, their own bumper sticker or motto is America first. You've seen decreased emphasis on the role of institutions, whether it's the European Union and NATO. Should be viewed in that context, where the arms control agreement is a reflection of what Katarina and Michael just kind of explained, but it's contested turf in the American foreign policy scene of whether this is the appropriate role to go or not. When you ask, why did we get out, and I think Michael alluded to this, it's really a very thin excuse for withdrawing from it. It seems almost like a manufactured crisis in the sense that whatever questions there were about compliance, there is a mechanism within this treaty, as there are in other treaties, to address issues of compliance. And the debate right now is, should the United States stay in the Open Skies Treaty, which has all the symbolic and functional utility that Katarina mentioned, or and address any concerns within that framework, or pull out? And it's part of this broader debate.
So if the United States flagged this, right? We knew President Trump intended to leave this treaty some time ago. Michael, you mentioned we don't know what Russia will do. Have they flagged their intentions in any way, or will they play a waiting game and see how things develop?
I think they signaled that they most likely will stay in, and that might be what some people in the administration are actually banking on, that they'll get to leave, but Russia will stay in the treaty, because the treaty is quite beneficial to the United States. Like many arms control agreements the United States signed with Russia, they actually tend to be, a lot of them, much more beneficial to the United States than Russia. For example, this treaty, Russia will stay in, so I think, so it can maintain overflights of US military infrastructure in Europe and NATO, most likely. It's not a certainty, of course. But of course, Russia hosted far more American overflights over its territory in Belarus than the United States did Russian ones. And all NATO countries overfly Russia and share that information with each other, but they don't overfly each other's territory as part of this treaty. So the treaty was highly beneficial to the United States and NATO vis-a-vis Russia. And I completely agree with Robert, the excuse that the administration was using to get out of it is that the treaty only gives it 99% of what it wants, as opposed to 100%. And so that's a reason to exit. So my personal suspicion is that Russia will most likely stay in, and Europeans will try to preserve the treaty because highly beneficial to them. But it remains to be seen if there's negotiation that takes place along that front. And I think Russians will, of course, try to roll it in as part of a broader position that paints the United States as the country looking to abrogate stabilizing arms control agreements and exit them unilaterally with negative impact for European security. And it will combine this with its position trying to brand U.S. withdrawal from the INF in that way. And most importantly, the coming up negotiation of extension of New START treaty, which we hope will happen, but Russians currently expect that most likely that too will expire.
Katarina, you mentioned the 34 countries that are part of the Open Skies Treaty, and we've been talking about 2. What European countries are most concerned about this potential U.S. withdrawal?
So the states are, I think the announcement didn't come as a surprise, because already back in October, Trump signaled the US intention to withdraw. But at the same time, it doesn't seem that there was any discussion about the US decision with its European NATO allies, which has put them in a difficult situation. And I can maybe reflect a little bit about what led up to the decision and what followed the announcement immediately. So in the lead up to the US decision, representatives from Germany, UK, and France, among other countries, intervened in Washington to signal their support for the treaty. And Swedish Defense Minister sent a letter to Mark Esper expressing deep concern. Another effort was one from the 16 retired military commanders and defense ministers who released a joint statement that was coordinated by the European Leadership Network, which urged the United States to remain in the treaty while at the same time warning European countries to be prepared for the US exit. And some of the immediate reactions that followed the US announcement was a joint statement of 11 European member states that supports the treaty. There was a statement issued by Poland, by Ukrainian Foreign Ministry. I think that the treaty is particularly important for Germany, which has just invested 120 million euros in the development of a new aircraft. Overall, I think that the European member states see value in this treaty and acknowledge there are implementation disputes, but as Rob has mentioned, they believe these problems can and should be solved through diplomatic channels, namely within the Open Skies Consultative Commission. So they don't think that these violations provide enough ground to leave the treaty.
Rob, Mike mentioned that the New START treaty could be the last treaty standing that the Trump administration will withdraw from. As someone who has spent a big chunk of his professional life in non-proliferation and arms control issues, how concerned are you about this breakdown of the entire international structure of arms control?
I think it's quite concerning because, for the period since the end of the Cold War, the conventional wisdom was that the risk of nuclear war between major powers was highly unlikely, much less likely than during the Cold War period, as relations improved. Now relations with Russia and China are entering a more fraught period. And these arms control decisions about the future disposition of these treaties is occurring in a context where new technological trends are on the horizon. Not only is the United States embarking on a new modernization for obsolescent nuclear systems built in the 1980s, largely, which is necessary. There's a case to be made for that, but it's being conflated with the debate about new missions and low-yield nuclear weapons and missions and contingencies that might lower the perceived kind of nuclear threshold. There's also hypersonic technologies coming on to the fore, which could allow conventional strikes against nuclear assets on both sides. There's a thorny set of issues related to that. I think Michael's quite conversant on these issues and might want to comment that make the current context extremely kind of complicated and fraught. And I think the utility of the New START framework is it's precisely that. It's a framework that sets a cap. It also provides a framework within which modernization issues can be addressed, and also parsing out issues that arise from new technologies that could, in a crisis situation, which is looking more likely now than it did in the 1990s, could have real stability implications.
Mike, about some of these new technologies that Rob has talked about, and whether it's Space Force or whatever the Trump administration has rattled the saber about, how concerned is Russia about a new arms race?
Well, look, you always have two aspects to an arms race. You have qualitative improvements in different types of weapons that can have strategic significance for countries, and you can have an actual quantitative arms race where we talk about the numbers of weapons deployed, right? So when a treaty expires, you first go back to the classical problem, that is, there are no longer quantitative limitations on deployed nuclear weapons. And you don't know if either country will attempt to break out from that. You have the stability problem, which is you don't have mechanisms for verification and inspection, so you don't know what's going on. The United States has strong upload options, that is, it has missiles that have slots for nuclear warheads that can be added to that missile, so it can dramatically increase its deployed strategic nuclear warhead count. Russia has very strong breakout options with non-strategic nuclear weapons, of which it has quite a few. And then you talk about the qualitative changes to nuclear weapons or new weapons like hypersonic weapons. They particularly change the character of war more at the operational and theater level. There's strategic significance, right? That these weapons have deployed in Europe, whether land-based or sea-based, it doesn't even really matter. Now that the INF treaty is gone, you can land-base hypersonic weapons. It will dramatically reduce, in my view, crisis stability, and it leads to a lot of considerations and debates in both countries about the potential for first strikes, disarming, decapitating strikes, about what it means for NC3, or about just in general what it means for leadership decision-making time, right, and crisis stability in these scenarios, plus the entanglement, the integration of conventional and nuclear capabilities. When you have forces that are deployed with both conventional and potentially nuclear armed capabilities, you don't know which ones they're going to fire, et cetera, et cetera. I hope that makes sense. There are a lot of challenges to be addressed, and of course, there is no obvious new arms control down the pipe. What we have seen is a steady dismantling of all the arms control regimes that we've inherited from the Cold War, which actually were being adapted and extended to address current military capabilities over time. But you can see that quite a few people in the administration would rather get rid of it, and you see the nuclear superiority community more winning, at least in that conversation, as opposed to the strategic stability community or the disarmament community.
And of course, all of this is happening at a time when global economies are reeling from the impact of COVID-19. And everything we're talking about here today has a big price tag, not just in terms of security, but also in terms of actual dollars. I want to get a final thought from each of you. You've already address the notion of whether this makes the world more stable, and it sounds like the consensus is it does not. And so thinking ahead of where this all might be headed, and do you see any light at the end of the tunnel? I saw some speculation, for example, that the Trump administration has designs on a grander agreement with Russia, and that leaving these old agreements could be an opportunity to chart some new course. I don't know if that's just wishful thinking or if it's just irresponsible speculation, quite frankly. That's what I want to hear from you. How do you see things moving forward? Your final thoughts on this. And Katarina, let's begin with you. We'll go in the same order that we began our conversation.
So it would be naive to say that those who want new arms control architecture are wrong, but at the same time, we shouldn't be removing things without having a clear idea of what we want to put in their place. So I would recommend building on things and adapting things instead of scrapping things altogether and just taking us back to our Open Skies Treaty and the conventional arms control. The problem we have is partial compliance, not complete in compliance.
Michael, any final thoughts on this question? With the assumption that our goal here is more stability and a safer planet, where do we go from here?
Sure. I find the proposition the administration is going to somehow bring China to the table for arms control incredibly unlikely. Also unnecessary. I can't fathom why you would abrogate arms control agreements you have between two countries who constitute over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons to bring a country that has a tiny fraction of the world's nuclear weapons, that's not going to engage in arms control because it's actually not obvious what is in it for them, right? Or what means the administration could actually have to bring China to the table. I'm very much with Katarina. I understand why you would burn your house down so you could basically live alone in the field in this regard, taking away existing arms control regimes instead of having them and then building on them. Plus, I'm pretty skeptical of multilateral arms control. There aren't a lot of good cases of it, and it tends not to last very long. My view is that most likely we're moving to a world where we're going to have less arms control, and at best we're going to move to agreements that are arms limitations agreements, where we'll try to perhaps countries will exercise restraint on capabilities deployed, numbers, quantities, and the areas where they are deployed.
Sounds like a step backwards, Rob. Major step backwards.
We're experiencing COVID-19 right now. Global pandemic, game changer in global politics. There are two other issues that could bring about change of comparable magnitude. One would be climate change, and the other is kind of the nuclear question and the possibility of nuclear use. We think of nuclear in three categories: the size and composition of arsenals among the nuclear weapon states, the proliferation of new states, third is nuclear terrorism. In each of these categories, we need expanded international cooperation to address the challenges posed. In the nuclear arms control category, as Michael said, consolidate what we have with Russia. China's a different set of issues, and the magnitude of their program is less. On so-called horizontal proliferation, Iran, North Korea, we need global cooperation, such as we had with the JCPOA and the multilateral effort made on North Korea. And finally, on nuclear terrorism, which was a big issue 20 years ago, and a little less than 20 years ago after in the aftermath of 9/11. But it is there. It's a persistent issue of securing arsenals, securing nuclear materials to prevent what, in our polarized American politics, all of our candidates agree that a nuclear weapon in the hand of a terrorist group would be the worst scenario.
Rob Litwak, Mike Kofman, Katarina Kertysova, thank you very much for helping us sort through a complex topic. Your insights are greatly appreciated. I want to thank those of you who've been watching and listening as well, and hope that you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon for another. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.